I don't know what your shifts were like back in Columbus, but the night shifts here tend to get pretty weird," Anderson said, taking a long drag of his cigarette. There was a sign in the briefing room that said no smoking, but the ashtray in the center of the conference table told me that nobody actually cared. "It's fine. I can handle weird," I assured him, although that claim just seemed to make Anderson laugh. "That's what they all say, kid. Look, there's Columbus weird and then there's heaven weird. Believe me when I say, they're two completely different animals. And it's best if you don't ask too many questions about it." I couldn't help but find his tone a bit condescending. He talked to me as if it was my first day out of the academy, not like I'd been doing this for 5 years. Granted, it was my first shift in heaven, but I didn't think there was any excuse to talk to me like I was born yesterday. Looking back, maybe it was a mistake to pull up my roots and move out to Heaven, Ohio. But I had my reasons for getting out of Columbus. The Heaven police force was hiring, and I thought that starting fresh in some rural, small town might do me a bit of good. Even as Anderson talked down to me, I still told myself that this was just a bad first impression. Once I'd earned my spurs and proved I wasn't some greenhorn with nothing between his ears, he'd probably change his tune with me. I just needed to earn it. "Just follow the rules and you'll be okay," Anderson said. "It's that simple." "Sure thing," I said. I was actually doing a bit of reading up on the local... "Not those rules," Anderson scoffed. "I mean, yeah, those rules too. But I'm talking about the rules for the night shift. Nobody filled you in on those?" The confused look I was giving him seemed to answer his question, and he shook his head in exhaustion. "Jeez, they're really just hiring anybody these days. Alright, well, I'll run through them with you. It's pretty simple stuff. The long and short of it is, the church out on Aspen Park Road has a sort of special arrangement with the department. So there's a few unique rules in place with them." "Okay, what are the rules?" I asked. "Like I said, it's pretty simple stuff," Anderson replied. "Rule number 1 is that anything out of place you might see along the Aspen Park Road area goes directly to Officer Dean Norris. And I do mean anything. I don't care what you think you see out there. We don't touch it. It goes to Officer Norris and only to Officer Norris." "Okay, noted," I said. "But why?" "Because Norris knows how to deal with those people. That's why." Rule number 2. Under no circumstances are you to ever directly respond to or engage with anything you might see around Aspen Park Road. I don't care what it is. I don't care what you think you see. You don't respond to it. You don't engage with it. You make a note and then you... He gestured to me, waiting on a response. "Passed off to Officer Norris?" I finished. "Attaboy. He passed off to him. Rule number 3. If we run into anyone outside of the Aspen Park Road area with a tattoo of a dove skull on their left arm, we do not touch them. We let them go. They're with the church, so, like everything else, they go through Norris." I had some questions about that, but I figured it was probably best not to ask them right away. Rule number 4. We don't enter the church without permission. And rule number 5. We stay off Aspen Park Road between the hours of 7 p.m. and 1 a.m. So what, we just don't patrol that area? I asked skeptically. We do not. Why not? Because that's part of the agreement. Look, don't pick it apart. Trust me. The rules are there for a reason. Don't think too hard about it. Don't poke around asking questions. We do our patrol shift, and any problem that isn't covered by the church's rules, we deal with normally. Trust me. Most of the time, you won't even need to think about the church. If we wouldn't even need to think about it, why make such a big fuss over the church and its special rules then? The whole thing struck me as a little weird, but what was I really going to do about it? Anderson spoke with the confidence of a man who knew the reason for these rules. So maybe it was better to just accept them and go about my business. Besides, if he was right, and I barely even needed to think about the church, they probably wouldn't even come up again. Right? Still, this whole thing didn't sit well with me. Why have some arbitrary set of rules on how to deal with one local church? It didn't make a whole lot of sense. Maybe this was some kind of dumb prank. Yeah, that probably made sense. Maybe this was some form of hazing. It wasn't very professional, but at least it made sense. I tried to take Anderson's advice and just not think about it. I figured that on the off chance that this whole thing wasn't a dumb joke, there'd be some obvious, simple reason behind these rules that would make sense. Yeah, that had to be it. It had to be. Unsurprisingly, during my first couple of weeks on shift, the church on Aspen Park Road was a non-issue. We'd pass by the area, but we rarely ever drove down the road itself, and I only actually saw the church on a couple of occasions. At a glance, it didn't look like anything special. The Church of the Sacred Dove was a boxy, white brick building with a large chapel and a sloped roof. I probably wouldn't have even noticed it existed if it didn't have that special set of rules that applied to it. But I digress. My nights on patrol in heaven were a little quieter than my shifts in Columbus had been. We'd get a few calls per night, and usually dealt with drunks, noise, and minor disputes. The most excitement we had during those first few weeks was an incident where some drunk moron flashed a gun at the bar after the bartender tried to cut him off. And that was it. I'd almost completely forgotten about the rules Anderson had shared with me during our first night together. And when I saw my first weird sight out by Aspen Park Road, I was ready to call it in as normal before he stopped me. It had been a quiet night, even by heaven's standards, and Anderson had pulled into a small strip mall plaza to pick up a pack of cigarettes, some cheap coffee, and to have a chat with the owner. He stopped off at that same store every couple of nights, and the owner usually gave him the scoop on anything of interest happening in the area. Not that there was usually much. While he had his chat that night, I stayed outside for a cigarette. Standing under the cool night air, I took a long drag of my cancer stick and exhaled the acrid smoke. I couldn't deny that there was a kind of peace out there, under the stars. It was the kind of picturesque night I'd been dreaming of when I'd moved out here. It was beautiful. And as I stood under those stars, that's when I heard it. The distant sound of screaming. I paused, lowering my cigarette before walking out further into the parking lot. The screaming was faint, but it was there, and I could smell something burning on the wind. Not my cigarette. Something else. I found myself wandering towards the edge of the parking lot, following the sound and the smell. My cigarette was discarded and crushed underfoot as I got closer and closer to the road. There was something about that smell. It was faint but distinct, simultaneously sickening and sweet. It was a smell I could almost taste in the back of my throat. It was familiar, but not in a good way. It brought back a vivid memory of an incident back in Columbus where some drunk idiot had run his car off the road. There had been a fuel leak, and while someone had called for emergency services, by the time we got there, the car had already caught fire, and the blaze had turned the car into a burning casket for its driver. I was one of the officers on the scene at the time, and I remember the smell that had filled my nostrils when I stepped out of my cruiser. The scent on the wind that night reminded me of that. Burning flesh. Why was that? Why? Joey? The sound of my own name tore me away from my thoughts, and I looked back toward Anderson. He was standing by the cruiser, a cup of coffee in each hand. You hear that? I asked. Anderson was silent for a moment, before quietly opening the driver's side door. He didn't say a word to me. He just got in the cruiser. I paused before going to join him. I expected to see him fiddling with the radio, but he just keyed the engine. It was coming from the west, I said. There was a smell, too. Hard to describe. Not sure what it was. Don't worry about it, Anderson said. My brow furrowed. What? Why not? I asked. Church stuff. This kind of thing happens every now and then. Just make a note of it and pass it along to Officer Norris. We're not going to have a look? I asked. I heard people screaming. It's a part of their mass or something, Anderson said. Don't ask me for the details. I don't know anything about it. I just know that it's how they worship. Screaming. Fire. You get used to it. The hell kind of church are they? I asked. What'd I just say, kid? Don't ask me for the details. I don't know. And trust me when I tell you that it's better off that way. Leave a note for Norris, and he'll have a chat with them. That answer didn't sit right with me. That answer didn't sit right with me in the slightest. What was I going to do? Argue? Anderson had already put on the radio in an effort to end the conversation as quickly as possible, and was driving in the opposite direction of Aspen Park Road. Half an hour later, he was chatting with me like nothing had happened, like the screaming and the smell of burning had just been figments of my imagination. It was odd. Jarring. It was obvious he wanted me to just drop it, but I didn't become a cop to just turn a blind eye to stuff like this. Maybe it was just some sort of weird outdoor mass, but I knew I wasn't going to feel comfortable again until I knew for sure. When my shift ended, I went home to sleep for a couple of hours. I woke up again sometime past noon. The memory of the faint screams and the smell of burning lingered in my mind. I sat up in my bed. Anderson and I had made a note in our end-of-shift report that we'd heard something coming from the Aspen Park Road area, but that was really all we'd done. It didn't feel like enough. Maybe I was just overthinking all of this. Anderson wasn't the best cop I'd ever worked with, but he'd seemed like an alright guy so far. If he wasn't worried about this, then why should I be worried? The rules regarding the church were weird, sure, but there had to be a logical explanation for all of it. I probably was just overthinking it. Probably. But I had to be sure. Maybe going for a little walk along Aspen Park Road would put my mind at ease. No uniform, no badge, no gun. Just me going for a walk. Nobody would give me any guff for that, right? Just a walk along Aspen Park Road. Nothing out of order. Yeah, that would be fine. I grabbed my jacket and my wallet and went out for a walk. My apartment wasn't too far away. It was about a half-hour walk there, and I could probably use the exercise. There had been a light dusting of snow that night, making it finally feel like winter as I walked. The wind kicked up flurries of powdered snow as I made my way down to Aspen Park Road. In daylight, there really didn't seem to be anything all that special about it. It was an unassuming street on the edge of the more suburban part of town. The church and its property dominated a good stretch of the road, and on the other side of it was dense forest. Further down was a subdivision that couldn't have been more than 10 years old. The plaza Anderson and I had stopped off in was just a couple of streets over. As I wandered onto the church's property, I couldn't help but feel like I was trespassing, although I'm not entirely sure why I felt that way. The rules had said we weren't supposed to enter the church uninvited. They hadn't said anything about walking across the property, and really, that's all I was doing. Walking across the property. I wasn't harming anyone. I wasn't causing any kind of disruption. I was just walking across the property. There wasn't anything wrong with that, was there? This was a church, not Area 51. I wandered across the lawn behind the church, moving without purpose, not entirely sure what I was looking for. Evidence? Of something, I suppose? Maybe I'd know it when I saw it. Maybe. As I crossed the field behind the church, my eyes were drawn to the woods out back. I paused, staring thoughtfully at them, before noticing something in the snow. Some kind of clearing. It looked like there was a large bonfire pit in the middle of it. Interesting. I paused, then glanced back towards the church to make sure no one was watching me, before making my way over to the clearing. I was right about the bonfire pit. Someone had been burning something there, and judging by the blackened remains of wood covered in snow, it had been used recently. By itself, the bonfire pit wasn't really all that suspicious. Anderson had mentioned that fires were part of their masses. This had probably just been where they'd been hosting said masses. But the memory of the screaming and the burning smell still stuck with me. I'd seen religious whack jobs before. This mass hadn't sounded like any mass I'd ever heard before. Maybe I shouldn't have been hung up on that, but I was. Maybe if it was just the screaming, I could have let it go. But that smell, it still bothered me. I'd only smelled it once before, but I've heard people say that you never forget the smell of burning flesh. Maybe it was nothing. I wanted it to be nothing, but I had to know for sure. I crouched down beside the bonfire, brushing through the snow and the ash, still unsure what I was looking for. Maybe I was looking for nothing at all. Nothing would be proof that this was, well, nothing. My fingers brushed against something hard in the debris, and I fished it out. What I found was a small bone, bleached by fire. My stomach lurched as I examined it. There was no denying what this was. It was a bone, although it was hard to say exactly where it came from. This could have easily been an animal bone. By itself, it didn't confirm anything, but that reassurance did little to calm the uneasy sinking feeling in my guts. I turned the bone over in my hands, studying it, as if staring at it would help me figure out what it had come from. And that was when I heard the voice behind me. "You're a little late for Mass, aren't you?" I froze and stood up, pocketing the bone as I did. There was a woman standing behind me. She was about medium height, with narrow brown eyes and auburn hair that flickered like fire in the snow. She wore a white dress with no coat, despite the cold. I noticed a tattoo on the inside of her wrist. Some sort of bird skull, I think. I never got a good look at it. "Oh, sorry, just out on a stroll. I was just curious because I thought I saw a fire pit. I'm new in town. I'm just sort of looking for places to meet people," I stammered. None of what I said came out smoothly, and I tried to laugh off the awkwardness of it all. The woman just continued staring at me, smiling calmly. "It's quite all right," she said. "My name is Harmony. It's a pleasure to meet you." "I'm Joey," I replied. "No coat? You gotta be freezing." Her smile didn't change. "I don't mind the weather," she said softly. "You're new in town? I don't recognize you." "Yeah, just moved here. I was actually looking for a new church to join," I said, mostly just trying to justify why I was snooping around. I couldn't tell if she bought it or not. "I see. Are you familiar with our church at all?" "I mean, I've driven past a few times," I said. "You with the church?" "I suppose you could call me the local pastor," she said. "I took over from my father about, 10 years ago, give or take." "Family business, huh?" I asked. Her unfaltering smile seemed to widen a little. "I suppose so," she said. "Oh, but he'd probably hate what I've done with the place. He was a bit more of an evangelical. You know the type. There used to be a sign out front, preaching the coming end of days. I don't really subscribe to all that. My ideas about God are a little different than his." "Really?" I asked. "How so?" "He believed in church as a cudgel. Believe or burn in hellfire. I see it as a crook, bringing the community together, guiding them in one direction towards God." "Sounds nice," I said. "I'd like to think so. I believe in the strength of community. Whether or not you believe in God, you can believe in that. You can put your faith in that. Hence the bonfires. So, it's more of a community gathering than a mass? I asked. We do have more traditional masses, but many nights I'll have members of the community here, and we'll gather by the fire. It's a fairly informal event. You're welcome to join us if you'd like. You may even make a few new friends. I'd be lying if I said that the offer didn't sound a little tempting. But the unease in the back of my mind still lingered. And something about this woman felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was that vacant smile or the tone of her voice. Maybe it was something else. We'll see, I said. I work nights, but if I can make it out, I'd love to. Well, I hope to see you there, Harmony said. In the meanwhile, feel free to stop by if you ever need anything, or have questions. My door is always open. Yeah, for sure, I'll take you up on that, I assured her. Although, I should get going. I'll see you around. See you around, she replied calmly, and watched as I left. I could feel her eyes on me as I made my way back to the road, and when I looked back, she was still standing there, by the ashes of the bonfire, watching me. When I got back on shift that night, I had to ask Anderson about the Church of the Sacred Dove. I caught him by the station's gym about a half hour before we were due to start. He was on one of the treadmills, so I hopped on the treadmill beside him. He greeted me with a single nod. "How goes it, kid?" he asked. Can't complain," I said, half lying. "How are you doing?" Same old, same old. You know how it goes." I nodded, and we lapsed into small talk for a bit, shooting the breeze while I worked up to my real question. "So, what exactly is up with the church on Aspen Park Road? I've heard of some weird churches in my time, but they seem different." "Trust me, kid. The less you talk about them, the better," Anderson said. "Yeah, you keep saying. But I'd ask a few less questions if I knew why we weren't supposed to talk about them." Anderson huffed, before slowing down the pace of his treadmill. "It's a long, ugly story, kiddo," he said. "I'll admit, even I probably don't know most of the details." "Well, what do you know?" I asked. "It used to be run by some old Bible thumper. Your typical hellfire and brimstone preacher. It was a lot less interesting back then. But after he passed away a few years back, his daughter took over. She's a lot more, what's the word for it? New Age, spirituality, occult stuff, animal sacrifices." "Animal sacrifices?" I repeated. "Apparently they got an understanding with the county. Look, our job isn't to get into the politics of it all. Our job is just to keep the peace. Whatever they got going on out there, it's all above board with the county and the department. So it's best to just keep your distance from it. People get in trouble for poking around that stuff too much. I'd hate to see you ending up like them." "Fair enough," I said softly. Anderson stopped his treadmill and took a long swig from his water bottle. "I'm hitting the showers. Look, I'm not trying to intimidate you, Joey. I'm really not. But it's better if you don't think about the church. Leave a note for Norris, and you'll be so much happier." I think he was trying to be reassuring with those words. But if anything, his adamance just made me more uneasy. While Norris went off to get showered and changed, I left the treadmill and moved on to the exercise bike. I thought about the bone I'd found earlier. If they were using the bonfires for animal sacrifice, then the bone had probably come from that. But there was still a gnawing uncertainty in the back of my mind. And as I sat on the exercise bike, I knew it wouldn't go away until I found out for sure. My nights working with Anderson were quiet. We broke up a few loud parties, dealt with some domestic disturbances, and picked up a couple of drunks down at the bar. That was really it. Nothing seemed to happen around the Aspen Park Road area. If anything, things were especially quiet out there. For a few nights, at least. It was about 3 days after I'd found the bone that I saw a man in a white robe running down the street. We'd been driving in his direction when I noticed him. It was impossible to miss him, even in the dark. Our headlights lit up those robes of his like a Christmas tree. We were only about a block from Aspen Park Road. I clearly remember that the time was just past midnight. "Anderson," I said, hastily pointing out the man as if he wasn't right in front of us. I saw him stare at the man on the street. I expected him to slow down and put on our lights and check in on the guy. He didn't. He just regarded him quietly and moved over a little bit to avoid hitting him. The man seemed to see us, and outstretched his arms, running for the car. I could see genuine terror on his face, a wild-eyed panic that threatened to venture into hysteria. Anderson still didn't stop. He just kept on going, veering past the man who desperately tried to chase after us. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked. "Rules are rules, Joey," he said plainly. "We just keep moving." "The hell we do?" I snapped, before trying to unlock the door so I could get out. We weren't going that fast. I could get out of the car without getting hurt. The moment I put my hand on the door, though, Anderson grabbed my wrist, braking hard. "Don't," he warned. His eyes burned into mine, more intense than I'd ever seen them. The man in the white robe had caught up with our car. I could hear him banging on my window. I could hear him screaming, Help me, please, please, please." Tears streamed down his cheeks as he tried to pull my door open, but Anderson locked it. "We don't respond to the things we see out here, Joey," he said, his voice eerily cold. "We leave them be, and we leave a note with Officer Norris." I just stared at him, completely incredulous. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Jesus, Anderson, there's a man pounding on our window," I snapped. "We don't respond." I tried to open the door again, but he lunged for me, pinning me to my seat. "This is for your own good, kid," he growled, as I struggled and tried to fight him off. Outside the car, the man in the white robe was watching us, eyes wide with terror. I noticed 5 new figures behind him, emerging from the darkness on the edge of the street. All of them were dressed in black robes with hoods that hid their faces. The man in the white robe didn't seem to notice them just yet. He was still focused on Anderson and I, fighting in the car. Anderson glanced over at the man. I know he saw the figures approaching him, but he did nothing. He just kept his weight on me, leaving me helpless to stop what was coming next. The man in the white robe finally seemed to notice the newcomers behind him. His reaction was one of visceral terror. "No," he rasped. "No, please, please." He started to run, but the robed figures closed the distance quickly. I squirmed violently beneath Anderson, trying to reach for the taser in my belt. As soon as he realized what I was doing, he grabbed my wrist. "Don't," he said again. "Just let it go, Joey. Let it go." All I could do was watch as the black-robed figures dragged the screaming man away. He fought against them. He kicked, he cried, but he couldn't escape. They took him away, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I pounded on Anderson's shoulders like a kid having a tantrum, but he refused to budge, keeping me pinned to the seat. "The rules exist for a reason," he said, his voice low and heavy. "I get it. It's not in your nature to look the other way. I get it. But you don't get involved in the church's affairs. Do you understand that?" That man was running, I tried to argue. "And we'll leave a note for Norris." "Who the hell even is Norris?" I snapped. "Who is Officer Norris, huh? because in the few weeks I've been here, I've never once seen or heard anyone else mention anyone named Officer Dean Morris. But he's the guy we sent to deal with these calls. A guy who, as far as I can tell, doesn't exist. That man was running scared, Anderson. We're supposed to do something about it. I tried again to push Anderson off of me, but he still wouldn't budge. Don't, he said. Joey, don't. Go to hell, I snapped, before finally slamming my head against his, and knocking him back just a few inches. I threw the cruiser door open and stumbled out. The man in the white robe couldn't have gotten far. I just needed to catch up and... Pop? Suddenly, every muscle in my body clenched, as I experienced what I can only describe as the unholy combination of a full body cramp and getting hit by a baseball bat. I'd been shot with a taser before, back during my training in Columbus. I'd always hoped I wouldn't have to experience that again, but I guess Anderson had other ideas. I crashed down to the ground with a heavy thud, twitching as I did. Anderson stood over me, watching me writhe on the ground. Don't be a hero, Joey, he said. Heroes don't last long in this town. And the rest of us survive by following the rules. This is her town. It's been her town for the past 10 years. So please, stop. I rolled onto my back, panting heavily. I saw Anderson staring down at me. I could see that he'd drawn his gun. He wasn't aiming it at me, but it was there. A silent warning against trying anything else. After a moment, he offered me his hand. Stand up, he said calmly. Let's call it a night. Get us a coffee and move on, okay? Let's put this behind us. Despite the sincerity in his voice, I think he knew damn well that putting this behind us wasn't really an option. I could see it in his eyes. But behind his stoic determination, I could also see hope. Hope that I'd see the light and just let this go. I let out a tired exhale before reaching for his hand and letting him pull me to my feet. Attaboy, he said. Let's get you a coffee, all right? Come on, into the car. He gestured to the open passenger side door, and I shuffled in. My entire body still hurt, but there wasn't much else I could do. Anderson closed the door behind me, before rounding the car to get in the driver's seat. His mistake was taking his eyes off of me. I'm not proud of what I did next, but if we did things Anderson's way, we would have been abandoning the man we'd seen to his fate. Maybe he could do that, but I couldn't. I'd reached for my pepper spray as soon as he closed the door, and when he got back into the car beside me, I emptied the entire can into his face. Anderson screamed, thrashing violently and collapsing back out of the car. I heard him scream my name, but I didn't waste any more time on him. I threw the back door open and stumbled out into the street. Joey! I heard Anderson yell, but I was already running, following the robed figures back toward Aspen Park Road and the church. It didn't take long before I heard the music, frantic drums being pounded and chaotic singing. I could see the light of a bonfire up ahead, around the same clearing I'd visited the other day, and this time I could see figures dancing in the firelight, circling the bonfire which towered over the dancers. I paused before moving into the nearby woods, letting the trees and darkness hide me from the gathering as I drew closer. I counted around 20 to 30 people around the fire. About 5 of them were dancing around it, all dressed in ceremonial robes that twirled and swished around them, leaving their legs and feet bare against the elements. Each of the dancers wore an elaborate bird skull mask adorning their heads. Their dance looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. Their arms swayed in rhythmic, circular patterns, They barely even seemed to move like humans. At the entrance of the clearing, watching the dancers, stood a lone woman, adorned in a familiar white dress. Like the dancers, she too wore an elaborate bird mask and stood barefoot in the snow. Harmony. It had to be her. Congregated beside her, I could see two groups of black-robed figures, each one of them holding back a stranger clad in white. One of them was the man I'd seen on the road. The other was someone new. A second man who looked no less terrified than the first had. There was a part of me that wanted to rush into the clearing, gun drawn, to try to break up whatever this was. But something else kept me rooted to the spot, watching in awe. The dance reached its maddening crescendo, and at last all of the dancers collapsed into the snow, prostrating themselves before the fire. Only then did Harmony speak. "We offer now our chosen, at this hour of winter. We offer them to you, O greatness, O holiness. He of sickle claw and gnashing beak, he of endless eyes and grinding teeth. We offer you this paltry feast, O holiest of holies." She raised her arms, and, as if on cue, the two captured strangers were dragged toward the fire. I could see them fighting. I could hear them screaming. The smell of burning flesh lingered in my memory, as did a vivid mental image of the bone I'd found in the ashes of that very bonfire. In that moment, I knew that every fear that had lurked in my mind about this place was well-founded and true. They were going to burn these people alive, sacrificing them to what? God? No. Not God. Something else. I went for my gun. The people in the clearing didn't seem armed. I could shut this down. I could end it. I needed to end it. I fired 3 shots into the air as I charged out of the trees. Harmony calmly turned to look at me as I did. "Whatever the hell this is, it ends now," I spat. "Let those people go." The figures in black didn't respond. They held their would-be victims tightly as they struggled to break free. "Well, Joey, was it?" Harmony asked, her voice still unsettlingly calm. "Seems you made it to one of our gatherings after all." "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I'm putting an end to it," I snapped. "Let those people go. Now." I leveled my gun at Harmony's chest. She just chuckled. "It's charming that you think you hold authority over me," she said. "But very well. I'll humor you." She clapped her hands twice. "Let them go." At her command, the 2 prisoners were released and took off at a run. "There. See? I'm capable of being reasonable," she said softly. "He, on the other hand, is not." "What are you talking about?" I asked. "You really are clueless about what we're doing out here, aren't you?" Harmony asked. "I'm not surprised. You're with the local police, aren't you? I suppose they didn't adequately explain our arrangement with them." "Just because you've got them in your pocket doesn't mean you got me too," I said. "In my pocket?" She laughed. "You really are small-minded. I suppose you think that this is either madness or some sort of conspiracy, don't you? But it's all much simpler than that." "Then enlighten me." "This ground we stand on is consecrated. We stand in God's temple, and we stand here in prayer. Only, our prayer is a little more direct than most." She looked over at me, before noticing the confusion on my face. "My father didn't understand it either," she said. "He believed God wanted loyalty, prayer, servitude. And yes, he wants these things. But above all, he wants food. He wants to be fed. And so, we feed him. Lady, you are well and truly nuts, I said, keeping my gun trained on her. Get on the ground. Hands behind your head. You're going to arrest me? She asked wryly. You think he will allow you to so much as place a hand on me? Let's find out, I said, keeping my gun on her as I drew nearer. She didn't put up a fight. She only watched me, moderately amused as I drew nearer to her. I put a hand on her shoulder, trying to force her down to her knees. And as I did, the clearing grew infinitely brighter. A blinding flash rose from the flames. Not a flare from the fire, but something else. The bonfire seemed to grow, seemed to change. For a moment, I was sure that there was something in the fire, something watching me. I couldn't make out exactly what. I could make out details, shapes, wings, eyes, but not much else. My ears began to ring. The light around me was blinding. I couldn't look at it. I couldn't focus. I didn't remember falling in the snow, but I must have, because Harmony was standing over me, smiling down at me through that bird mask of hers. And so now you see, she said, before looking back toward the men in the black robes. Cast this one into the fire. As he has freed our intended sacrifices, he shall take their place. I meekly tried to stand, but I felt hands grabbing me, forcing me to my feet. The gun was torn out of my hand and taken away. I stared into the fire. Countless eyes stared back at me from the flames. No, was the only word I could stammer out. Wait. Wait. A new voice echoed through the clearing. Harmony turned to look at it. Anderson stood at the edge of the tree line, holding up a hand in a futile effort to stop my coming execution. Don't do this, Anderson panted. Don't do this. He's cost us our sacrifices this evening. Why should he be spared? Harmony asked. Please. It's my fault he got involved. I should have stopped him. Should have made him realize. Please. It's my fault. So we should take you as opposed to him, she hummed. How noble. Give me one reason why I shouldn't cast you both into the fire and be done with it. He's seen what you do here. He knows what's in the fire, Anderson said. He's more used to you alive now. Just like I was. Just like Norris was. Harmony was silent for a moment. Oh? She asked, before giving a dark chuckle. And so, we finally come full circle, don't we, Jeremiah Anderson? I saw Anderson hesitate for a moment, before giving a single nod. Yes. Yes, we do. Harmony seemed to think for a moment, before giving a nod. Very well, then. If you're so adamant, then you will go to the fire. Anderson didn't reply to that, but his eyes locked with mine. There was meaning in that last look he gave me. More meaning than simple words could have conveyed. Scolding, fear, hope, and a plea. With that one last look between us, I understood Anderson better than I had in the weeks we'd worked together. I didn't say anything to him. Didn't nod. I just stared back at him. Grateful. Terrified. Uncertain of what might happen next. Thank you, Anderson said. I'm not sure if he was talking to me or Harmony. Then, he turned and stared into the fire. Taking one final breath, I watched as he began to walk toward it. His footsteps faltered. There was fear permeating his every movement. But he didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. He offered himself to the fire. And as it consumed him, as the flames melted the flesh from his bones, filling my nostrils with a stench of burning meat, as his screams faded into the night, I watched. It was about a year later that they sent me a new recruit to work with on the night shift. Some kid from Toledo. He'd been a cop for 3 years, and had figured that starting fresh in some rural small town might do him a bit of good. As I met him for the first time in the break room, before our first shift together, I sized him up, then lit myself a cigarette. I don't know what your shifts were like back in Toledo, but the night shifts here tend to get pretty weird, I said. It's fine. I can handle weird, he assured me. For some reason, that made me laugh. That's what they all say, kiddo. Look, there's Toledo weird, and then there's heaven weird. Believe me when I say they're two completely different animals. And it's best if you don't ask too many questions about it. Look, just follow the rules. You'll be okay. It's that simple. Rules? He asked. Nobody had told him about the rules? I sighed and shook my head. Jeez, they're really just hiring anybody these days, aren't they? I asked. Right. Well, I'll run through them with you. It's pretty simple stuff. The long and short of it is that the church out on Aspen Park Road has a sort of special arrangement with the department. So there's a few unique rules in place with them. Okay, like what? He asked. Like I said, it's pretty simple stuff, I replied. Rule number 1 is that anything out of place you might see around the Aspen Park Road area goes directly to Officer Jeremiah Anderson. And I do mean anything. I don't care what you think you see out there. We don't touch it. It goes to Officer Anderson and only to Officer Anderson. Officer Anderson? I don't think I've met him yet, the kid said. Don't worry about that. Odds are you'll never meet him. But he knows how to deal with the folks at the church. So whatever you see out that way, whatever you hear, it goes to Anderson. You got that? The trainee nodded. But I knew he didn't understand. He thought he did. Just like I once thought I did. But he didn't understand. He couldn't. Not unless he saw it for himself. I understood, though. Just like Anderson once understood. You can't fight a god. All you can do is play by its rules. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.